So friends, I am so thrilled today that I get to turn the interview tables on my friend Brian Tyler Cohen. If you're familiar with our work, you know that we have a legal series that we do together called The Legal Breakdown, which posts over on Brian's YouTube channel. Please subscribe to his channel if you're not already, and please hit subscribe to my channel as well. I get to talk to Brian today about his new book, Shameless, and we're going to turn to that in a minute. But first of all, Brian, I hope you're prepared for me to ask you the tough questions today as the person doing the interview for a change.
That's right. Let's see if I'm able to hack it in the hot seat here.
So first of all, Brian's new book, which is just published on Tuesday, I will put a link to where you can buy Brian's book in the description for this video. It is titled Shameless, Republicans' Deliberate Dysfunction and the Battle to Preserve Democracy. And as you can see, it is full of Post-it notes where I dog-eared basically every other page because there was something sort of revelatory on every other page. And I use that term advisedly, revelatory, because, you know, as I was reading through this book, it's both timely because, you know, we have the presidential election fast approaching, and Brian has a whole lot to say about that. You know, he is the political pundit and the political expert. I certainly am not. But I'll tell you, I learned so much by reading his book. And, you know, I thought not only is it timely, but it's timeless, because a lot of what you're going to see in Brian's book are some prescriptions that he sets out for how to cure what ails us. And that is what ails us both in the political arena and, frankly, just as importantly, and I'm looking forward to talking about this with Brian, what ails us with respect to mainstream media and how mainstream media is covering, for example, you know, the presidential election and, frankly, all things politics. There's a lot to be learned about where we are and where we need to go moving forward if we're going to do better. So with that in mind, let me ask Brian, first of all, what is an easy question, but perhaps a big question. Why the title Shameless?
So that's a great question. I wanted to look at all of the ways in which Republicans try to bolster their brand and how they do it so shamelessly by clinging on to these values of the past, maybe of the Reagan era, but certainly not of today. You know, Republicans claim that they're the party of the Constitution, the party of family values, the party of fiscal responsibility and states' rights, and law and order is one that we speak about quite a bit. But in reality, they don't actually comport themselves with those values, but they certainly do use them to give themselves cover while acting antithetically to those values. And I thought, I'm looking at this, and the way that they cling on to purported values without actually exhibiting any behavior to prove them out, I felt was so shameless. And so the point of this book is really to expose how the things they do to give themselves the benefit of the doubt and to reach out to the American people and to garner their support and their votes are actually predicated on nothing. And I felt like the better that people can have a sense of that, of how they're not actually the party of family values, not actually the party of the Constitution and law and order and states' rights and fiscal responsibility, the better informed we'll all be in terms of making the right decision moving forward.
You know, and you share so many examples of Republican shamelessness, and they are illuminating. Frankly, they're horrifying. But there's one that I want you to talk about a little bit, which I think is perhaps a marquee example of Republican shamelessness, and it is what we've all experienced recently with them proposing a border bill and then killing the border bill. Why does that kind of fit in under the heading of Republican shamelessness?
I mean, it's the one that we're seeing wielded in this very election. So for years and years and years, Republicans have beat their chests about how the border is not only such a terrible issue for the Democrats because we want open borders and we want to bring in drugs and immigrants, but this idea that Democrats weren't willing participants in actually solving the issues at the border. And so what happened in this Congress is that Senator Chris Murphy, Kyrsten Sinema, and conservative Republican James Lankford got together and negotiated one of the most conservative border bills that has ever been put in front of a Democratic president. And Joe Biden expressed a willingness to actually sign it. And by the way, that border bill only included border security, no comprehensive immigration reform, which is usually an absolute condition set forth by Democrats, but it didn't include that. It was just border security. Democrats said, if you actually want to fix this, if you actually believe that it's as important as you say it is, and you want to get this thing solved, let's go. You have willing negotiating partners in us. The thing was negotiated by a conservative Republican. We're willing to pass it in Congress, and we're willing to have our Democratic president sign it. And then Donald Trump issued his clarion call to his sycophants and mouthpieces in Congress and said, you cannot sign this bill because I want to be able to wield the issue of the border in my presidential campaign against the Democrats. And so that's exactly what they did. They refused to take this bill up, even though, again, it would solve all of the issues that they themselves claimed were these massively important issues. Issues that were so important, it would get wall-to-wall coverage on a daily basis on Fox News, Newsmax, OAN, all of right-wing media. And yet, they themselves were the ones that were responsible for killing this bill, all because Donald Trump wanted to be able to talk about it, to wield it as a cudgel against Democrats in this election. And lo and behold, we are now in this election cycle, and that's exactly what he's doing. And yet, instead of every single time he opens his mouth and says something about the border, the media pushing back and saying, well, hold on a minute. If the border is that serious of an issue, why did you yourself prevent the bill that would solve the issues at the border from actually getting passed? But of course, the media doesn't do that. They just take him at his word, and they amplify his comments and just take it as a given that even though we all know he's responsible for entrenching the problems at the border, that suddenly, because he says so, it's the Democrats' fault. And so it's a failing not only of the Republican Party and their purported values and what they claim to care about at the border, it's a failing of the media to hold them to account for it.
Yeah, and I want to talk in a few minutes about how mainstream media's treatment of issues precisely like the one we're discussing, what we can and should do about it. Because I know there are those who would say, well, you've got right-wing media, you've got left-wing media, you've got Fox on the right. Some will say you've got MSNBC on the left, so it must overall be fair and balanced, all good, right? But, no, because I watch a lot of MSNBC. I happen to be a legal analyst on MSNBC. You're a political analyst on MSNBC. But, when I saw how MSNBC seemed to be obsessed with always telling us about Joe Biden's alleged cognitive decline. But you look over on Fox, you know what they never talk about? Donald Trump's obvious cognitive decline. So there is no parity. These things do not balance out just because some will say, well, you got media on the right and media on the left. And I definitely want to talk with you more about that because you do have a prescription about what we can do to impact that and to do better moving forward. And I think we have to do better moving forward because, as you say in the book, Brian, we can't just sit here and hope mainstream media changes its practices, right? Like it's going to grow, it's going to move forward, and it's going to begin to do better. But you do have a prescription. I want to turn to that in a minute. But finishing up on the shamelessness of the Republicans proposing a border bill and then killing their own border bill because it would have been perceived as giving a win to Joe Biden. It kind of plays into one of your overarching themes in the book. You say that the Republicans wreck government so they can shout about government being broken, or you put it another way, you say dysfunction is not a byproduct of what the Republicans have been doing, it is the goal. Talk a little bit about broken government and dysfunction as the goal of the Republican Party, and what do they think that gets them?
I think what Republicans have sought to do over the last few decades is go in, break government, seek to destroy it from the inside, and then point to the thing that they just broke as evidence that, in fact, it can't work. And then they swoop in and present themselves as the party of small government. So they're basically proving out this theory by virtue of circular logic that the only reason they should be elected is because they're the party that believes government can't work, and yet they're the one themselves who are breaking it. The antidote to that, though, is we look at what Democrats did with their 2 years in power, with, by the way, the same exact margin in the House as Republicans had just prior to that. And Democrats were able to pass the American Rescue Plan, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, the PACT Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Gun Safety Law, reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act, codified marriage equality into federal law, all while adding 16 million jobs and bringing the unemployment rate down to a 50-year low, with wages now outpacing inflation, which is down to its 2% target. So this is what you have. This is the result of government working. This is the result of what happens when you have people in charge of government who actually believe in the core functions of government. So when we look at what the Republicans are saying about government not being able to work, all you have to do is look at what the Democrats did with, again, the same margin that Republicans had, and look at how much they got done.
Yeah, so let me now turn to one of my favorite topics that you take up in the book, and it is not an easy topic to wrestle with. And I'm going to break it into two parts: messaging and distribution of the message. First of all, I'm no political expert, you are, but even I know the importance of messaging in the political arena. You might even say it's the messaging, stupid, right? Yeah. Harkening back to James Carville in 1992, it's the economy, stupid. It's the messaging. Dems are not typically great at messaging. Nobody has ever accused them of being the party of strong messaging.
Right.
So, for example, you talk about in your book how, Hillary Clinton she was a beast on policy. She was so good. She would issue, I think you said, 16-page policy memos on the benefits of subsidizing child care. But what seemed to be missing at times was the messaging.
Right.
Like, let's save kids. 3 words. You got to get the messaging out, or the substance is never going to break through and stick. Dems are great about laying out the unfairness of gerrymandering and the evils of voter suppression. But how about a message like, let people vote? 3
Right.
words. And then you point to how Donald Trump, who's not good at many things, who's not adept at much, but he's pretty darn good at messaging. And you say, compare the Dems' lack of messaging to, quote, the 3-word chants. Trump barks like a fascist mother goose. Build the wall, lock her up, drain the swamp, stop the steal, all of which is bullshit. But boy, it's really effective bullshit, and it sticks, and it impresses and persuades his base, his supporters, even though it's bullshit. So what would you say about how the Dems need to get better, what they should be doing, and how they should focus more on messaging?
Great question. So I think right now we're actually seeing it play out. And I never thought I would say those words writing a book about Democrats' pitfalls in terms of messaging. But to their credit, to Kamala Harris's credit and Tim Walz's credit, they are finally learning the lessons of the Trump administration and the Trump campaign, and that is to stick to messages that are short and embrace repetition as a policy, basically. And so for the first time, we're seeing Democrats go up and saying, we're not going back, repeating it. How about when we fight, we win? How about Tim Walz going up there and saying, mind your own damn business? These are short messages, they're effective, they resonate with people, they're relatable, and they are repeating them over and over and over. And it's not like they're doing it with devoid of policy, because Democrats are correct on policy. They have the policy that the vast majority of Americans support, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on reproductive rights, whether it's on labor unions, whether it's on health care, whether it's on gun safety. So the policy is there, but the messaging had always been gone. But now they figured out how to message more effectively, basically learning a lot of the lessons from the Trump era, and now Trump, without any new messaging, and in fact, with messaging that kind of hurts him in the sense that he still has people chanting lock her up when he's the convicted felon and his opponent is the prosecutor in this case, the tables have been turned. And now Trump has the tired messaging. Trump is the one that doesn't have any flashy new slogans, and his supporters have been barking the same slogans for the last better part of a decade here. So to their credit, I think Democrats have actually gotten much better very quickly on the messaging front.
And the prosecutor versus the felon, boy, that has a ring to it.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about distributing the message. And that is, I think, the part I found most revelatory about the book. Talk a little bit about why it's your opinion, and I agree with you, that the Dems can't rely on mainstream media to get the messages out, even if they have crafted, a catchy, valuable message. Talk about how mainstream media plays into this, because what I took away from some of what I read is that the main problem may in part be mainstream media.
In fact, there is an over-reliance on presenting both sides and equating both sides that I think has just decimated trust in mainstream media and has in large part hurt the Democratic Party by equating everything that the Democrats do to everything that Republicans do, despite the glaring asymmetry at play. And so, that is exactly why, despite Donald Trump committing blatant crimes out in the open, because there has to be this sense of like equal time or equity on the two sides, they have to confer all of this undue attention onto Hunter Biden. And they went through this 16-month ordeal where the only thing they found out was that the investigation was based on some bogus 1023 form put forward by somebody who would ultimately be indicted by the FBI for being a Russian asset. And yet, think about how much breath they wasted focusing on Hunter Biden. Think about how much breath they wasted focusing on Hillary Clinton's emails in the lead up to the 2016 election. And yet, when Ivanka Trump did the exact same thing during the Trump era, came and went like a fart in a hurricane. Nobody wanted to talk about it because they recognized that it wasn't a real story. But the mainstream media propped this up because they were given this assignment by the right, knowing full well that if they didn't cover this kind of stuff, then the right would accuse the mainstream media of being the liberal media. And God forbid anybody ever calls the mainstream media the liberal media. And so the liberal media has to bend over backwards to prove to these people that they're indeed not liberal, hoping that they'll gain some elusive acceptance from them, and they won't. Republicans will continue to call the Washington Post and the New York Times and CNN fake news, regardless of how much benefit of the doubt they give to them. But still, they'll do it because they don't want to be called liberal media, and nothing ever changes. But that's the situation that we're in right now, and it does show a glaring asymmetry where basically the Republicans know they can game the refs in this situation, get the mainstream media to report on whatever they want by dangling the threat of calling them the liberal media. Dangling the threat of saying that you're being unfair, you're being biased in favor of the left, and what we're left with is ignoring real stories, like the Egypt story we're seeing right now regarding Donald Trump possibly getting a payment from Egypt, and instead we think about how much days and days and weeks and months we've wasted on absolute nothing burger stories only because they're being propped up by the right.
Yeah, and one of the most infuriating examples of that to this old Army vet is if I hear one more journalist ask vice presidential candidate Tim Walz about his 24 years of military service and whether it was enough and whether, he brought, disrepute on himself and whether he abandoned his fellow unit members because a few months after he retired, after 24 years of military service, his unit was deployed. Of course, he had deployed a number of times prior to that. And I swear, Brian, I hear that question asked over and over and over again when it is pure garbage. We should be applauding his 24 years of military service. And he retired so he could then take up another form of public service by running for Congress. And yet, I guess if, J.D. Vance said, well, Tim Walz drinks nothing but bat's blood. Are we going to have mainstream media journalists asking Tim Walz week after week, month after, tell us about this bat blood thing?
You will. That's the crazy part of it, is you will, because they take their cues from the right. Instead of doing their job and pushing back on this stuff themselves, they view themselves as some arbiter between the two sides because they take what Republicans say at face value, even though we know after years and years and years of listening to them shovel their lies out into the mainstream press that they still get the benefit of the doubt at the end of the day. And so Republicans will say something and the mainstream media will take that at face value instead of rebutting it, stopping it in its tracks and saying, no, this isn't what it is. Instead of saying Tim Walz served 6 times as long as J.D. Vance. Instead of saying that Tim Walz had served longer than J.D. Vance, by the time J.D. Vance was born, Tim Walz would have already served a longer military career than J.D. Vance ever would. But here we are left in a situation where for a lot of instances, the media acts as a megaphone for right-wing misinformation and disinformation and bad faith talking points.
And a related topic that you highlight in your book, and I'm not sure I ever heard anybody put it quite this way, mainstream media doesn't seem willing to take up for democracy when its very existence depends on the continuation of democracy, as I usually put it far less eloquently. There's no two sides to treason. And yet this is what we see, and I think it reinforces exactly, what you're arguing in the book. And so what I think the next question has to be, and you take this up in the book, is how do we do better on the distribution front? Let's assume we have the message, and we know we have the substance. How do we do better on the distribution front?
Well, I think what you and I do is kind of living that out in real time, which is we need to continue to create, support, and grow an independent, progressive media infrastructure. Because if we have the message, we just need the form of distribution. I speak with Dan Pfeiffer in the book. That was Obama's communications director. He's the co-host of Pod Save America. He basically says Democrats spend all of this time crafting the perfect message, getting the perfect messenger, saying the words that we want to say, getting the message we want to say, getting the tone we want to say, and we take that perfectly crafted message and hand it over to somebody else to distribute, hand it over to the mainstream media to distribute. And of course, they put it in their both sides framing, and they do with it what they will. And by the time it actually reaches people, of course it doesn't look like how it's supposed to look like. Of course it no longer looks as crafted as when the Democrats handed it to them. But it's ridiculous of us, when we think about it in that respect, of us to hand our message to people who aren't even aligned with us, and in many cases are subverting democracy by their inability to meet the moment, and give them the message to deliver to the rest of the American people. And so our job is to grow an independent media ecosystem where we can actually correctly and appropriately and accurately reflect the will of progressive values and the Democratic Party and the politicians who are actually trying to enact this stuff, so that there isn't this asymmetry where you've got Republican networks, you've got Fox and Newsmax and OAN, and you have the radio shows and Steve Bannon's show and Alex Jones' show and Ben Shapiro's outlet, and there is no equivalency on the left. CNN and ABC and CBS and NBC are not the equivalent of right-wing propaganda outlets. And by the way, there's many people who say they shouldn't be. But it's still, the point remains that there is an asymmetry. And this is not to say that we should be the equivalent of Alex Jones' show. Certainly not. We can do this in a virtuous way, in an honest way. But we do need some type of infrastructure to fight back against the deluge of misinformation and disinformation that they're spewing out into the political media ecosystem.
Yeah. So let me end on a positive note. One is a story that you share in the book about something your mom did that surprised you in 2020, and I would love for you to share that with our Justice Matters friends.
So my mom had never voted in her entire life. Over 60 years, she'd never voted. And this was even despite what I do for a living. And for those who think like, wait, you do political commentary on a daily basis on YouTube for an audience of 3 million people, and you couldn't even get your own mom to vote. I don't know how to properly convey the stubbornness of a Jewish mother. So I would have better luck getting the sun to rise at night than convincing my mom to do anything. So you just know when to pick your battles, basically. So I never tried to proselytize her, basically. She would watch my videos, but I knew that there was really no point, that I would have better luck trying to persuade everybody else. And I got a text message during the 2020 election that showed my mom at a ballot box holding her ballot, and she had voted down ballot Joe Biden and the rest of the Democratic Party, and voted for the first time in over 60 years. And so the point I'm trying to make with that is that we have agency here. And Glenn and I, we talk about this all the time, this idea that every single person's vote matters. There is a reason that Republicans are trying so hard to take everybody's right to vote away, and that is because they understand how potent everybody's individual vote can be. And if you look at a place like Wisconsin, for example, the difference between a Joe Biden win in 2020 and a Donald Trump win in 2020 was 2 votes per precinct. That's all it took for Joe Biden to win what is largely considered the tipping point state. And so if it's just 2 people per precinct, that should give you an indication of the agency that we all have. And so my hope in this book is to let people know that if you're able to reach 1 or 2 people, it could very well be the difference between winning in the tipping point state and losing in the tipping point state. So we have a lot of agency here. We also have a responsibility to find people who wouldn't have otherwise voted, who wouldn't have, made sure that they were aware of what's happening in politics, who maybe have been subject to mis or disinformation on the internet, and make them your responsibility heading into November. And that's something that we can all do. So, I basically the point I want to make is that I'm not asking everybody to do everything, but I am asking everybody to do something, and clearly it can have a big impact.
Great rallying cry. So just as I think we try to do in our legal breakdown videos, I'm going to try to end by finding some silver lining, right? Some hope, some optimism. And now I have to go all the way back to the beginning of your book. And for anybody scoring at home, it's page 16. And Brian writes this, talking about some of the problems that are that we're encountering as a result of the Republicans' shamelessness. You say, the rise of a problematically biased mainstream media ecosystem, finding election loopholes to exploit, preventing young people and minorities from voting, undermining the validity of election results, all of these strategies took root early and remain essential to the modern Republican playbook. Considering the manipulation and resources devoted to stopping our democracy from functioning, it inspires some shred of hope that, big picture, Republicans are still coming up short. You think they're going to come up short this November?
I do. I think we are much better aware of the threats that we face. They have had a long time to try to entrench these advantages, whether it's in the media, the left-wing media, the right-wing media, these advantages with regard to voting and voter suppression efforts, these advantages on messaging. But I think that if Democrats were able to stave off these efforts when we were largely ignorant of what was happening, the fact that so many more people are educated and well-informed about what's going on, and that's in large part thanks to the work that you do, by the way, on this channel, I think that it's going to be increasingly difficult for them to be successful in this upcoming election. So I think that that's why the work that you do is so important. It's why it's so important that people keep tuning into this stuff so that we're aware of what's happening and that we arm ourselves with the tools to make sure that we're making the correct decision come November.
Well, Brian, thanks for spending the time today. I would urge everybody to pick up Shameless. There is a link in the description of this video to where you can get it. As I say, it's revelatory. I learned a lot. There's a lot of good, useful information about how we can do better moving forward and why we have to do better moving forward. So I can't recommend Shameless strongly enough. And Brian, thank you for being with us, and I will look forward to talking tomorrow in the next legal breakdown video that we're going to do.
Glenn, thank you so much for the time, and see you on the other side.